Thank you, University of Mississippi Slavery Research Group. Building HBCU capacity through partnerships project at Tougaloo College. Thank you for them. The Institute for the Study of Modern Day Slavery at Tougaloo College, another sponsor. The Brown University President's Office, President Brown University. Thank you, Brown University. The Brown University Office of Institutional Equity and Diversity. If you would give all our sponsors a round of applause. If they were not sponsoring that, then we would have to charge you for that chicken you eat. It's also my pleasure to invite to the stage Attorney Edwin Blackman, a civil rights icon for the state of Mississippi. And he's chairman of the Tougaloo College Research and Development Foundation Board of Directors. Attorney Blackman.
Good evening. Good evening. My job is already done because I heard it if you did. John said welcome. So he's already done it for me. But this is even though I pass this building daily on High Street going back and forth to the Capitol where I've been for the last 37 years in the Mississippi House of Representatives, I've never stopped by to take a look at it. So I guess I have to welcome myself too. I happened to walk through the rotunda there and I heard playings of civil rights songs and just reminded me how I got my start. From there to here, I recall that when I was about 16 years of age, maybe 15, I was walking by my family's church and I heard them singing in there. And I walked in, it was a summer day in July. Didn't have much to do in Mississippi back then, no summer entertainment. I walked in the church and they were singing songs and praising, and NAACP leaders were there, my pastor was there, and I didn't know what they were getting ready for, but it felt real good. And when they said, all stand up, who's walking out? I stood up as a youngster, and they were singing on We Shall Overcome as they walked out of the door. And I walked straight into a army of policemen, was promptly arrested, taken to jail for parading without a permit. That's what it was then. Best thing that ever happened in my life. We talk about legacies, and the legacy of slavery, I was a part of that movement. In that, in the 3 days I spent in jail, I saw for the first time in my life, except for Perry Mason on TV, a black lawyer who came to visit us and said, I'm your lawyer. And I looked at him, he looked nice, dressed nice, had a briefcase, and I said, I want to be whatever you are. And that started me on my way, that's why I'm here tonight.
Very good.
But this is long overdue. History is oftentimes written by people who might not have a bird's eye view. And I know we're a mixed crowd here tonight, black and white. But one of the things that I've regretted over the years when I've tried to find out about my legacy and my history, the people that I identify with in my family, and wondered where and how, I've had to go to various sources to find that information, some of which, or most of which, has not been all that accurate. And when I heard of this from John, the first time I even heard of the idea that perhaps that some of our most revered universities and colleges around the country actually had a lot to do with where we are today in this country. That they owned slaves, they profited from slavery, they were participants, and how that impacted their being, how it impacted us today. And I want to know about that history. I really want to know about it. I want to know if there's anything that can be done not to erase that, not, as John always says, it's not reparations. But what can we do by bringing together these groups of people like we have here tonight, and tomorrow and the next day, to bring that to light and then find a way to impact the future. And for that reason, I'm welcoming everybody here and grateful for everybody who's participating. And hopefully at the end of not hopefully, I know at the end of the next 2 days that we'll all be better informed and have direction, and I hope hopefully energized in our efforts to correct history and to plan for the future. Welcome to this first symposium studying universities and colleges in slavery.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much. The program in front of you was literally put together almost by one person. Ann Twitty agreed to volunteer to help us to put this program together, and she literally helped us put this program together. So Ann, will you please come forward? And as she comes forward, let's give her a thank you for putting this together.
Well, I have my own debts to pay. First of all, it has been absolutely wonderful to work with John and also to work with Claudette Smith and Matisse Bruce, who have been just a joy to pull this program together, and I think we have an amazing program for you. I teach at the University of Mississippi, and I am on the leadership team of the University of Mississippi Slavery Research Group. And we are also delighted to be co-hosts of this event. We have a number of individuals who are involved in our organization who are going to be presenting over the next couple of days, and we are just really excited to be here. I also want to draw special attention to the help that I received from 3 graduate students in particular who I brought down here from the University of Mississippi, Michael Marino Bradley, Chet Bush, who I believe is over there, and Andrew Marion, who, if I literally pulled the program together, they literally stuffed all of those folders you received with those programs, and have been just all around wonderful guys to help kind of bring this program to fruition. It is also my pleasure to be able to introduce our keynote speaker this evening. Our keynote speaker is Jamar Tisby. I'm going to say a few words about Jamar, but I also want to mention that this keynote is a part of a lecture series that the University of Mississippi Slavery Research Group is hosting during this academic year. We're calling this the Year 400 lecture series, and it is a lecture series designed to draw attention to the anniversary of 1619, which is generally taken to be the date at which African slavery was introduced to what ultimately became the United States. So that's a year-long series, and Jamar is one of the speakers that we're delighted to have as part of that series. So Jamar grew up in a town north of Chicago called Waukegan, Illinois, and he earned his bachelor's degree from Notre Dame University. After graduation, Jamar joined Teach for America, where he was part of the 2003 Mississippi Delta Corps, and he taught 6th grade. Specifically, he taught 6th grade at KIPP Delta College Preparatory School, and he spent a number of years in that 6th grade classroom before he briefly returned to school and then found that he was called back to KIPP. Specifically, he was called back to KIPP to serve as their principal, which he then did for 3 additional years. In 2016, Jamar joined us at the University of Mississippi, and he is currently a PhD candidate at the Arch Dalrymple III Department of History at the University of Mississippi. And I am very pleased to report to you all that Jamar has recently advanced to all but dissertation status, having just passed his comprehensive exam. Now, along the way, as if that wasn't impressive enough, Jamar also somehow found time to actively participate in the African American Leadership Initiative at Reformed Theological Seminary in Jackson, where he ultimately earned his Master's of Divinity. He's also served as president of The Witness, a Black Christian collective. He's the co-host of the Pass the Mic podcast, and he's written a number of op-eds for the New York Times. And oh yeah, did I mention he also just finished his first book? Jamar's first book is going to appear in January 2019 with Zondervan Press. And the title of this book is The Color of Compromise, The Truth About the American Church's Complicity in Racism. This book is going to take us on a journey from America's earliest days all the way through the Civil War and Jim Crow, through the Civil Rights Movement to today's Black Lives Matter movement. And it's going to look at the obvious and I think sometimes hidden ways the American church has compromised biblical teachings about human dignity and equality. Jamar also in this book is going to chart a path forward, challenging us to reverse these patterns and systems of complicity with bold, courageous, and immediate action. It is available for pre-order on Amazon, so I encourage you to all pick up a copy. It is my absolute pleasure to introduce to you all Jamar Tisby, our evening's keynote speaker.
Good evening. As Dr. Twitty mentioned, I did receive my bachelor's degree from the University of Notre Dame, which is to say that I became a college football fan. I didn't grow up that way, but when you get to the university, you quickly get indoctrinated into such practices. And so I was engulfed. You've seen the movie Rudy, or at least heard of it. It's the real deal. People are passionate about their football there. I remember if you ran into the occasional student who actually was not going to go to a home football game, you looked at them sort of like they had cursed in church or something. What are you talking about? I remember the students used to stand the entire game. The only time we sat down was during halftime because we wanted to support the players on the field. And then in a tradition they still show on television after the games, the football team, win or lose, crowds up next to the student section. They all link arms, as do we in the stands, and we sing the alma mater of the University of Notre Dame. And so when I enrolled at the University of Mississippi, I was excited to be at another football school and to participate in this sort of school spirit. And then that fall in 2016, I went to my first and probably my last football game at the University of Mississippi. You see, that particular day, they were handing out stickers. Those stickers said, "State funds, state flag." The idea being, University of Mississippi as a public university is receiving state funds and therefore should fly the state flag. Now, this is a logical assumption, right? Except for the fact that Mississippi is the last state in the Union that still flies the Confederate battle flag in the canton. But that's not all, because what struck me was I ran into an old friend who happened to be an alumnus of the university and also happened to be a former football player at the University of Mississippi. He was just in the stands, and so we struck up a conversation. Well, in the middle of that conversation, someone overheard us and overheard my friend saying he was a former football player, and this guy, being a huge football fan, turned around, completely interrupted our conversation and started asking my friend questions. When did you play? Who else was on your team? Do you remember this person, that person? What have you? And I just kind of stepped back and was observing the situation. And it was so interesting to me that this man, who's wearing this sticker with this symbol, was talking to this black man. They were yucking it up. They were having a great time. And it went through my mind, does he have any idea the conflict here? This man who's supporting this flag with this emblem that's inimical to the dignity of people who look like me and like this guy he's talking to, in the midst of a game with dozens of players who are all black, almost, and he sees no contradiction there. That, to me, encapsulates what it's like to be a student in the state of Mississippi and at the University of Mississippi. So, a couple caveats as I get going here. Number one, I'm not from around here. You maybe could tell that every time I open my mouth, people's first question is, where are you from? I'm from the Midwest, but I consider myself an outside advocate, not an outside agitator. An outside advocate because I've been in the Deep South all of my adult life. I've been a student of the South, and I've grown to love many parts of it, the food, the culture, and of course, the people. And so I'm for the state of Mississippi. I'm for the University of Mississippi. I want to see them do the best that they possibly can. The other thing is, I am a PhD candidate in history, but I'm a second-half U.S. historian. So my studies pick up right after slavery, right after the Civil War and emancipation. And furthermore, I'm sort of like a second-half U.S. So I study the post-war era of the 20th century, which is to say that my primary research is not about slavery, but all of my research is affected by the legacy of racism, white supremacy, and slavery. Let me say this one last thing. I'm just going to say those words like racism, white supremacy, white and black, because I think we're all grown-ups here, and you know where I'm coming from, okay? So, if it sounds blunt, I apologize, but the times are urgent. And we need to deal with these things. And so given that, I just want to give you my perspective as a student in this state and at this school, and talking about repair. And so, the plan is simple. I promise you I did not mean for all of these words to start with A. It's just, these words just came to mind. So one of the things I want to talk about is the anguish. That is what it's like to be a student at a university that has such a strong connection to the Confederacy. There's a level of pain and weightiness that goes along with that. Secondly, I want to talk about the absurd. Now, I don't mean that in a demeaning way. I mean absurd in that it defies logic. Absurd as in when you step back from this, you wonder how could this possibly be. Then I want to talk about the anger. I think anger in the face of some of these things is the appropriate response. It's a righteous kind of anger. And then lastly, I want to talk about how we move from anger to action, where we don't just sit there, but we press forward to make this a better place. And so a couple more instances of the anguish, just what it's like on an everyday basis to go to school in the University of Mississippi. Because the question I always get is, you go to school where? And underlying that question is, why would you go to a place that seems to celebrate slavery, the Confederacy, the Old South? Don't you know you black? Yes, I know. And I know the history as well. And to be honest with you, I have some responses to that question, why I go to school here, why I live in the Deep South. But I think it's helpful still to dwell in that tension. Because there is a tension. So, if you say the University of Mississippi, it's a mouthful. It's 10 syllables long, 11 if you include the definite article. But I force myself to say it almost all the time because I can't bring myself to say the nickname. Now there's a lot of lore and stories, and defenders of the name will say it has nothing to do with race. Okay, still, it's a little too close to the edge for me. So it comes from the days of slavery, of course. On the plantation, they had the male plantation owner who was called the master, and they had his wife and the female head of the household who was called the mistress. The nickname for the master was oftentimes Old Marse, and the nickname for the mistress of the plantation was Old Miss. Now they've since changed the mascot for the university, but it used to be, for much of its history, Colonel Reb, short for rebel, as in the Confederacy, as in defending slavery, as in demeaning people with skin my color. And so it's difficult. This goes back to the school spirit thing. Wherever you go to school, whatever organization or institution you participate in, you want to be part of it. You want to be part of it in the fullest way possible. But even the branding of the university puts a barrier between students of color and their allies. I tried to buy shirts for the people I love and who support me. I couldn't find a single one without that phrase on it. And so we go without swag. Another instance. This is a statue. If you drive into the University of Mississippi, at the main entrance there's a circle drive, and standing, towering at the entrance to the university is a monument to the Confederate dead. This is in memorial of the university graves during the Civil War. Almost every single student joined on the side of the Confederacy. In one particular memorable occasion, a unit from the university participated in Pickett's charge in Gettysburg and sustained 100% casualties, 100% either wounded or killed. And so this monument stands as a testament to their bravery. But it also casts a cold shadow over the university, particularly for black people. Here they valorize the soldiers who gave their lives in defense of race-based chattel slavery that would have kept people like me in chains. What's ironic there too is just a few hundred yards away is the statue of James Meredith, the first black person to integrate the University of Mississippi. And both of these monuments stand in almost the same space and at the same time. Now, thanks to the work of university historians and the research group, you have an effort to contextualize. And so there's this plaque there now that was put up recently that says why that statue was put there, what it means, where we are now. And so there's a nod, there's an attempt, there's an effort to say that this is not the identity of the university anymore, and yet and still, the statue stands. There's the statue of James Meredith on the same campus there. Now that's some of the anguish that goes along with being a student. You have this constant dissonance, this constant sense of questioning, do I belong here? Am I wanted here? That shouldn't be the case at our colleges and universities across the country. But you know, it's symptomatic, not just of the university and not just of the state, but it's symptomatic of this long, you could call it even an obsession with the Confederacy. Now there are some other parts of the entire state of Mississippi going beyond the university to the absurd. Again, the absurd. I think what's happened is this. In the United States, we've become so accustomed to racism and the push for justice coexisting that we don't even notice it anymore. We don't even notice the contradiction sometimes. We are so immersed, in fact, in Confederacy and the mythology and the symbolism that goes along with this idea of a mythical Old South that it's become like the water we swim in and we don't even notice it. But when you step back and you think about where some of these things come from, the absurdity hits you. So for example, every state has 2 statues in the capital. The statues of Mississippi are telling. Now, Brian Stevenson of the Equal Justice Initiative has a say. I think he's onto something. And that winning of the narrative war is shown in these statues that as a state, we have chosen to represent us in the nation's capital. This person is James Zachariah George. And let me tell you a little bit about Mr. George. He was born in 1826. As a matter of fact, on October 26th, so just a couple days away, will be the anniversary of his birthday. He moved to Mississippi at a young age, and he served in the Mexican War in a unit commanded by Confederate President Jefferson Davis, the man who would become the president. He became a successful lawyer and increased his ownership of enslaved black people from 12 in 1850 to 30 by 1860. He was one of the signers of the Mississippi Articles of Secession, which state our position is thoroughly identified with the institution of slavery, the greatest material interest in the world. A lot of people will try to argue today that the Civil War was not about slavery. Well, at least Mississippi's Articles of Secession say differently. And his staunch support of white supremacy earned him the nickname the Great Commoner, because in spite of his wealth, small farmers and lower income whites in Mississippi thought he was a man for them by being against black people. George went on to serve on the Mississippi State Supreme Court, where he was immediately elected Chief Justice. He also served in the U.S. Senate. And by the way, he couldn't even get elected to the Senate during Reconstruction because radical Republicans didn't want a white supremacist segregationist there. But when Reconstruction ended in Mississippi, he never lost office. Most notoriously, George was known and celebrated as one of the architects of the 1890 Mississippi Constitution, the one that effectively disfranchised black voters in the state and served as a pattern and a model for other southern states wishing to do the same thing. At the end of the day, George did not believe that black citizens could effectively participate in a democracy. And it should be noted that in a recent examination, speaking of democracy, Mississippi was deemed the hardest state to vote in. It's called the Cost of Voting Index, and it seeks to, quote, quantify the net effect of a state's election laws to determine the time and effort it takes to vote there. From the article, it states, the index finds that voting is hardest in Mississippi, which comes in dead last in the ranking. The state requires a photo ID at the polls. It does not allow early voting or no excuse absentee voting. And so the legacy of making voting difficult is still with us today. Perhaps surprisingly or not surprisingly, depending on your perspective, George also served on the Board of Trustees for both the University of Mississippi and what became Mississippi State University. And that's not the only statue we have there. There's also the statue of Jefferson Davis. Now, before I get to just the statue, have y'all been to the Jefferson Davis Presidential Library and Museum? Because that's a real thing. Now, we're used to presidential libraries going to former presidents of the United States, but Jefferson Davis, the president of a rebellious, newly formed and failed nation, he gets his own presidential library in Mississippi. Now, I visited there. Why? I don't know, I was curious, and it was quite interesting. So there's the exterior of the library museum down near Biloxi. There's his house, and proof. I needed photographic proof that I was there. This is a statue of Davis and his two quote-unquote sons. One was an quote adopted black child who they made a great deal about saying how well he treated him. This I thought was interesting because they say the sequicentennial of the quote War for Southern Independence. Not the Civil War. The War for Southern Independence, sort of an ennobling and a glorifying of the Civil War for the South. And then I loved the gift shop. They had all the kind of Confederate flags and Mississippi flags that you could wish for, and then this one was my favorite, the pajama pants, filled with Confederate flags. And so we have Jefferson Davis representing the state of Mississippi in the Capitol. Davis, of course, was the president of the Confederacy. He served as commander of the Mississippi Regiment in the Mexican War, and Mississippians voted him to the U.S. Senate. As a senator, he called himself, quote, a national Democrat. He did not initially support secession, but once Lincoln was elected, Davis thought it would be impossible to maintain the Union, and duty-bound, he accepted the presidency of the new Confederacy. What strikes me about Davis is that even though he and his forces lost the Civil War and he was for a time imprisoned and stripped of all his wealth, he was able to retire at the beautiful Beauvoir house, which I was standing in front of. He died at a ripe old age and lived out the rest of his life celebrated by the people of the former Confederacy. Now, how starkly his end contrasts with the ends of many people who fought for justice, of many people who fought on the side of the Union, of many black people now freed after the Civil War, but without a penny in their pocket. And yet the leader of a rebellion has a nice retirement. The absurd. Add to these, first and foremost, the flag. And I'll say more about that later. But the flag of the state of Mississippi with its Confederate emblem. Even look at the names of several counties in Mississippi. Calhoun after John C. Calhoun. Forrest after Nathan Bedford Forrest. George after James Zachariah George. Jackson after Andrew Jackson. Jefferson Davis County. And of course, Lee County after Robert E. Lee. It's embedded in the culture of the state. This mythology of the Confederacy. But take a step back for a moment and try to remove yourself from this environment that's steeped in the celebration of the Confederacy and ask yourself, is this not absurd? Is this not ridiculous? Now you think I'm speaking harshly, but I'll get to this in a moment when I talk about the anger. The reason I say those things is because I'm experiencing this as a black man in America. I'm not experiencing this as an abstract research issue. James Baldwin says, to be a Negro in this country and to be relatively conscious is to be in a rage almost all the time. I think he's onto something there. And I think that anger is the proper and understandable reaction towards injustice in our society. For civility, incivility often erupts. People call it incivility when you protest injustice. But it's an existential issue. It's a dignity issue. In this talk, I've tried to convey a black student's perspective on Mississippi and the Confederacy, and that is who we need to bear in mind. It's the students. We must view this endeavor always from the perspective of those who are most adversely affected. What gets me and keeps me fired up is thinking about all of the young black undergraduate students who choose to attend the University of Mississippi, who choose to invest their tuition dollars, 4 years of their lives, their effort, energy, and reputations in a school that bears the marks of racism all around in the built environment. What keeps me angry and active is looking in the faces of people of color and their allies who have been hurt by racist actions and symbols on campus and beyond. What keeps me upset is that our HBCUs are facing constant and historic underfunding due to, if we're completely honest, from the days not so long ago and perhaps not even past, when our legislators loved the idea of separate but hated the idea of equal. When I speak of anger, I think of one of my heroes from Mississippi, Fannie Lou Hamer. At the Democratic National Convention, she did not want to compromise, and she said, "We didn't come all this way for no 2 seats when all of us is tired." And perhaps the quote she's best known for, "I'm sick and tired of being sick and tired." Now, I don't think she said this wearily. I don't think she said this with an exhausted kind of breathlessness. I think she was fired up. I think she said, "I'm sick and tired of being sick and tired. Let's do something." And I think that's what we're called to do today. So how do we move from anger to action? African-American historian John Hope Franklin said, "I cannot imagine how knowing one's history would not urge one to be an activist." And I think he's right. When you study the history, when you look at the absurdity, when you look at the anguish, how can you not take action? And that's what repair is all about. So some suggestions. 1, make Juneteenth a national holiday. You know about Juneteenth? the day when the folks in Texas finally learned that they were free. And they celebrated black emancipation from slavery. Now, just from a purely historical perspective, this is one of the most epochal events, not just in black history, but in U.S. history. Why don't we celebrate this annually? Why don't we remind ourselves every year of where we've come from, where we are, and where we still have to go? Make Juneteenth a national holiday that everyone remembers so that we can celebrate freedom and liberation. Another suggestion: fully fund HBCUs. Yes. Historically, black colleges and universities have been and are doing invaluable, indispensable work on behalf of black students and indeed all of America. They've done it against incredible odds, against a legislature that has often been against them, and still they persist. Why don't we fuel their mission? Why don't we make it so? I mentioned before the statue of James Meredith. That's him integrating the University of Mississippi amid armed guards. A white race riot left 2 people dead, and yet he graduated. A few years later, in 1966, he initiated the March Against Fear. That photo won a Pulitzer Prize, and it is depicting him after he's shot by a sniper. Only reason he lived is because the would-be assassin was using a shotgun loaded with buckshot. Wrong type of ammunition. It spread out. It didn't penetrate deeply. But he's been through it. That's him recently. He was in my Sunday school class at church. I was teaching as if he had anything to learn from me. But he's still alive in his late 80s. Many of you have probably known him or interacted with him. He's an interesting fellow, unpredictable, a loner in many ways, but an indomitable spirit. It's folks like him who integrated the University of Mississippi. It's folks like him who have pushed against all odds to drag Mississippi, sometimes kicking and screaming, into the present and the future. It's folks like him who are still alive, which remind us this wasn't that long ago. It's been said that the moral arc of the universe bends toward justice. Well, it does not bend on its own. And so I say we initiate repair. The work you're doing relieves some of the anguish. The work you're doing focuses some of the anger toward action. And this is more than just a scholarly endeavor. This isn't about politics. It's about people. So why do I go to the University of Mississippi? Why do I stay in the Deep South and in a state like Mississippi? Because this is where the action is. Thank you.
Thank you so much. What an informative education we just received. If it were up to me, I would give each one of you a degree for the class that we just experienced. Not up to me. That concludes our program for the evening. We still have some food here, and the rest of the evening you may visit the Civil Rights Museum until 8 o'clock. Our lease expires at 8 o'clock. So enjoy the food, enjoy the museum, and we will see you tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock. There will be a USS business meeting at 8 o'clock, and the conference itself starts at 9. So thank you all. Have a great evening.